Good evening, ladies, if you can, and gentlemen, if you could please get a seat. We're going to get started with our program here in a moment. Thank you all for coming. We've been looking forward to this evening and what our guest speaker has to share with us tonight. I'd like to get Polly to do our welcome or our prayer.
Let's bow our heads. Our Father, as we gather together at this time, we thank Thee for our many blessings, for the opportunities for service, and for the privilege of meeting together. May we ever be mindful of the fact that life is enriched by friendship and mutual understanding. May our work help us bring our share of life, freedom, truth, and love to the world. May we work in harmony with one another toward the fulfillment of the noble aims of this organization. Amen.
All right, I'm going to ask Diana to come up and introduce our guest.
I don't think anybody's a big stranger of this man because he was our former mayor. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about him. He is a native of Memphis, Tennessee. He was trained as a secondary education teacher of social studies and history, and also he was educated as a lawyer. He worked in the St. Louis, Missouri schools, public schools, and was hired by the Kentucky Education Association as a labor consultant, and then subsequently hired by the Ohio Education Association as a labor consultant serving teachers, teacher organizations, and school employee organizations in western Hamilton County. He moved originally here to Mount Healthy, but then moved eventually into Forest Park and said that he wanted to get involved in the community, and he became a member of the Charter Commission and also of the Environmental Awareness Board. On the Charter Commission, he served with many of the founding fathers of Forest Park, many of the early mayors and council members. And so he is steeped in the history of the development of Forest Park. He eventually got on council and then became mayor when Jim Lawler resigned in 2007. He served as mayor from 2007 to 2021 when he retired from council. He has the distinction of being the longest serving mayor in Forest Park. He is a participant and a member of the local Democratic Party and also the Hamilton County Democratic Party. He is on the executive committee and one of the vice chairs. He is in his alumni association from college. He still is a part of that and does a lot of outreach into the community. The fraternity does a lot of outreach to mentor young black men, and also to provide baskets for needy families at Christmas time of foods and gifts and toys. And he had served also on the Red Cross. He's not doing that any longer, primarily helping people who have suffered from a disaster relocate into housing. And so I introduce you to Mayor Johnson, who's going to talk to us about the topic is 21st century leaders among the African community, but he told me, when I told him that he would be giving us a lot of history and be talking about a lot of people from the past, many names that we know, some names we don't know, who often worked behind the scenes and often preceded more recognizable names. But he is going to touch on people from today as well. So I turn it over to Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. I'm going to be leaning very heavily on women in history and those who made significant contributions. But first I thought I would go back to Black history, starting with what was initially called Black History Week. It was not Black History Month. A gentleman by the name of Carter Woodson, a historian, and a group that he worked with came up with the idea of Black History Week, or Negro History Week as it was called back then. And that went on for a number of decades. And how many, I'm going to ask some questions. You don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to, but just for the purpose of the discussion, did anybody in here go to Kent State University, or you know of anybody who did in Ohio, Kent State? It was the student body and the faculty at Kent State who in 1969 came up with the idea of going from Black History Week to Black History Month. And the first of these, they picked February because it was the month, February 12th was Lincoln's birthday, and February 14th was the birthday of Frederick Douglass. That's why the month of February was selected to be the month that we would celebrate Black history. It was first celebrated in 1970 at Kent State University. And then it grew from there. During the bicentennial in 1976, and as I look around the room again at you young people, a lot of you probably were not born then, but in 1976, President Ford, as part of the bicentennial celebration, declared that February would henceforth be Black History Month. And that is where we started and got the idea of Black History Month. Now, as I said, I want to talk about some of the people who we've read about and heard about all through history, but I'm going to talk about them in the sense of what other people did that helped to make them famous. One of the things that happened in this whole movement of Black history and civil rights, you know, we all know about the Martin Luther Kings, the George Washington Carvers, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, et cetera, et cetera. But before Rosa Parks took the seat on the bus and would not move to the back, there was a lady by the name of Elizabeth Jennings Graham. Now, Miss Graham was a young lady who, and this is, by the way, this was way back in 1854. She was commuting back and forth from her job, excuse me, and this was in New York City. And back then they had streetcars. A lot of places had streetcars. She had to walk further than she normally would have, so her father purchased her a ticket so that she could ride on the streetcar instead of walking back and forth to work. Well, on this particular day, when she got on the streetcar, she was told that she had to take a seat in the rear of the bus. She was not pleased with that because she had paid the same amount of money that everybody else paid to get on the streetcar. She was asked to leave. She did ultimately leave, but she filed a lawsuit against the city of New York and against the railroad company. It went to trial, and she won. She won $250, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but in today's money, that would be close to a settlement of somewhere near $1,000. But one of the very significant things about her case, her father looked for a lawyer to hire. And through people that he knew, he was told about this one law firm. Now, the law firm that he finally picked was a very prestigious law firm in New York, and they didn't take just any case. They only took cases for wealthy people. But they had this one young lawyer who was not necessarily a beginner, but if you know how law offices work, you know, you start at the bottom and hopefully one day, if you live long enough, you'll get to be a partner. Well, this young man took the case, and as I said, he won. But the significant thing about him was this young man went on to become the 21st president of the United States. His name was Chester A. Arthur. And I'm sure in reading history, when you had to learn all the presidents, his was one of the names that you learned. And if you're like me, it's probably one of the names that you never ever thought about again. But that was her lawyer. She won the case. Another case that was even more probably significant than that one, again, I'll ask the dumb question. How many of you, or not how, I'm sure we all know Jackie Robinson, but what do we know Jackie Robinson is being famous for? First black person to play Major League Baseball. Okay, but before he did that, he did something else that was very, very significant in history, in black history. And he was a second lieutenant in the Army. He was stationed at Fort Hood in Texas. And again, back then, it was a segregated army where even, you know, the black soldiers and the white soldiers were separated out. He had been given the opportunity to go to officers' candidate school, which he did, and he became a second lieutenant. Well, on this one day, Robinson, again, was like the woman before, wanted to take the bus into the town to do some shopping and just have a little fun. Well, he gets on the bus, and the driver tells him that he had to move to the rear because where he had sat was right next to the wife of one of his fellow officers. And he was told that he could not sit there, that he needed to move. He refused. And again, when he refused to give up his seat, the driver had called the EMPs, and they came and arrested him. And he was charged with a whole lot of stuff, a lot of things that did not really happen. They arrested him, and as I said, he was charged, but they were going to court-martial him. But in order to do that, they needed the signature of his commanding officer to move forward with the court-martial. His commanding officer refused to sign it, saying that, I know Robinson, he's not that kind of person. He would not have done all of these things that he's been charged with. Because he was charged with insubordination, disobeying a direct order from a superior officer. They even charged him with being drunk and disorderly. Well, when they could not get his commanding officer to sign it, the Navy transferred in another officer for that one day, solely for the purpose of signing the form so that he could be court-martialed. He went on trial. They had the trial. The court-martial trial only lasted 4 hours, a little less than 4 hours, because the people on the bus testified in his behalf and said that he didn't do any of those things. So he was exonerated. But the worst about that for him was he was a member. His unit was the 761st Tank Battalion, called the Black Panthers. They were that day being deployed to Europe to fight in World War II. He did not get to go because he was in court-martial. And I don't know how many of you have heard of the 761st Tank Battalion. Probably a lot of you have heard of the Tuskegee Airmen. Well, this group were tankers. They were in the Army, but they were in the tank division. Now, this group went on to, they went to Europe. Back during World War II, when a unit was in combat, they were on for 10 days in steady combat, and then they were withdrawn to the rear for R&R. But this battalion, the 761st, they were in combat for a total of 183 consecutive days, which is far, far more than they should have been. But this was during the time when the German army had mounted an offensive to try to roll back the tide that was moving toward Germany. And I know some of you have probably seen or heard about the battle where they surrounded Bataan. Well, the 761st was one of the first units. By the way, they were attached to the Third Army, which was commanded by George Patton. They spearheaded Patton's group that ultimately rescued Bataan. So all of this kind of ties together with who this man was, and he regretted that he never got to go to serve with his unit there. But he did. He did get an honorable discharge from the Army because he had not done anything wrong, except he'd sat in the wrong place. Now, a third person, and this one is before Rosa Parks. There was a young woman, a 15-year-old girl. Her name was Claudette Colvin. She, in Montgomery, Alabama, in the same place where Rosa Parks did, she got on a bus, and the same things happened to her that happened to Rosa Parks. But the leaders of the civil rights movement would not use her as the quote, as the face out front. And the reason they didn't was, first of all, she was 15 years old. Secondly, she was pregnant, and she was not married. And back in that time, that was strictly taboo. They would have called her a bad girl. But so instead of her, they used Rosa Parks to be the front person, and that's who we all have learned about in school. We've all learned and heard about Rosa Parks. Now again, I say, I'm not, that doesn't diminish what Rosa Parks did. It's just that we never got taught about the other people who did it before and the importance and the significance that they played, their roles that they played in that. So, but history, that's what history is. History is like whoever, a military analysis would be, if you win, you get to write the history. And in writing the history, you can pretty much tell it the way you want it told. Again, there was before Martin Luther King at the church, pastor of that church, there was a gentleman by the name of Vernon Johns. Now, Vernon Johns was probably just the opposite of Martin Luther King. He was very aggressive. Now, he was a minister, but to talk with him, you never would have known it. He did things that suited him. And he got on a bus as well, and they told him, but unlike everybody else who's been through that, he said, hey, I'm not getting off this bus till you put my money back in my hand that I paid you for my ride. And it took them a while, and finally one of the police officers said, it's more trouble than it's worth, just give him his money back. So they gave him his money back, and he got off the bus. But the thing about it, the significance of him is he was the minister of that church just prior to Martin Luther King taking over there as minister of that church. So then also down through, going through history, again, you all probably know about Pullman Porters. Do we all know? I'm assuming that at some point in our lives, mine, I should just speak for myself because I'm old, riding trains was one of the major sources of transportation. Obviously, most people could not afford to fly. So to get from point A to B, people took trains. Well, almost all of the people who worked on the train, especially in the sleeping cars, were young black men who were porters. They they were not paid very well, and they were treated very, very badly. Not necessarily by the people who owned the company, but by the passengers, because they had to deal with passengers from all over the country who were riding on the trains. And in a lot of cases, they were abused. But there was a gentleman by the name of A. Philip Randolph. He went to the organized unions to try to get them to take in the porters as part of the union movement, and they wouldn't. So he formed his own union of Pullman porter riders, and excuse me, and that became the first totally black union in this country. A. Philip Randolph was a very, very intelligent man. He knew how to get things from people, and he used his intelligence to get what he wanted to get. So he negotiated a contract, and it was the first contract that a major company had negotiated with black workers. So the other thing about A. Philip Randolph that you may not know is back during the war years of 1941, as I said, the military was segregated. There was a movement on the way to desegregate the military, and A. Philip Randolph and his organization they started to first organize a March on Washington. Now, obviously, it was not the same march that took place in 1963, but this was the first of many marches on Washington. They were marching for better jobs and better treatment on the jobs. But that march never took place because in the process of his trying to negotiate with the government, they made a deal with President Franklin Roosevelt that they would call off the march if he would in turn issue an executive order. And I know in today's world, almost every other day there's some executive order about something, but this happened to be a good one. He issued Executive Order 8802, which banned segregation in the military. Now, like so many other things that happened, even with the bannings today, issuing an order for something to happen and making it happen are totally different things. By him issuing that order, it became the law of the land that day, but it didn't change anything. It was 7 years later with President Truman that the military actually did away completely with segregated units. But this was just one of the things that was done. And I make this reference because years later, during the Civil Rights Movement, there was talk about, let's put together a march on Washington. Well, this man, A. Philip Randolph, was the head of the organization that came up with the idea of the March on Washington. Now, there was another gentleman that probably most people have never heard of, and his name was Bayard Ruskin. He was a socialist. He was an activist. He was the principal organizer of the March on Washington. He and two black women basically structured and organized that whole thing. Now, again, because in history books, those people's names are never mentioned, so you don't know about them. If you ask people today who organized the March on Washington or who led the March on Washington, 90% of the people are going to say Martin Luther King, but he did not. Martin Luther King, was the guest speaker at the March on Washington where he did the I Have a Dream speech. But the legwork and the organizational part of it was done primarily by this man called Bayard Russell. Now, Russell, one of the most important and significant things about him is almost every leader of the civil rights movement relied on and depended on him for ideas. He was probably, as even Martin Luther King said, he was probably one of the smartest people that's ever lived in this country. But he was forced to take a back seat, and he did it by choice. And the reason he took the back seat was, again, even though this was like the 1950s and 60s, it was very, very unpopular for somebody who was homosexual to be out front. So instead of being out front, he was kind of like Deep Throat in the movie. He was the man behind the people who were out front doing the things. Fortunately for all of us, he was not one of those kind of people that had to be in the spotlight or had to have the recognition. He was perfectly satisfied doing things as he did them. And he did a very good job of it. Because had it not been for him, a whole lot of things that did happen would not have happened in the same way. He also organized, was part of the organizing of the first Freedom Riders. Now, let me deviate a little bit, and I'm going to be jumping around here. And again, if anybody got any questions while I'm doing it, go ahead. There were several groups of Freedom Riders. There were Freedom Riders, there was an organization called CORE, and through them they organized the first of the Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders is basically a misnomer, because basically what they were doing was they were going into Mississippi, this first group primarily, trying to get people to register them to vote, and which was not an easy task. But then there was another group of Freedom Riders later on, years later. Anybody in here go to Miami University up at Oxford? Know of anybody who did? Oh, goody. Well, there was an event called Freedom Summer. Freedom Summer was organized to bring in young people to Miami University. At that time, it wasn't even called, the place where they were was not called Miami University. It was a women's college that was part of Miami. Well, they brought these young people in to teach them how to act and how to behave when they went south to try to help people register to vote. Probably a majority of these young people that they brought in were young white college students. And the majority of those people that they brought in, ladies, were women. It was not a glamorous thing to do, because they were told how they were going to be treated and how they needed to react to that treatment. Now, there are some of us who was in college then participated in some of the things that was going on in the sit-ins, in the demonstrations, in the voter registration. And I sometimes look back and wonder, how did I ever make myself, or how did my friends ever make themselves take that kind of punishment day in and day out, and not being able, mentally not responding, physically not responding. There are not many things worse in the world than you're sitting at a lunch counter or wherever, and to have somebody to just walk up, somebody you've never seen, you don't even know, just walk up and spit in your plate or spit in your face. And your duty was not to react at all. You were just supposed to take it. I know I'm jumping around here, sidetracking a little bit. I think one of the reasons that that I've been involved in politics or in government is because it's hard for me to imagine not voting today. It's hard for me to understand how anybody can look back on what it took to get you that right and not exercise it. There was not just one civil rights movement. There were several that was going on at the same time. And all of them did not necessarily agree on the way it should be done. We had the Martin Luther King session, a group of people who devoted themselves to nonviolence. Their whole thing was, we're going to do this, but we're not going to react. No matter what happens to us, we know we're going to get arrested. We know we're going to get thrown in jail. We know there's going to be the water hoses and the police dogs and all that, but we're just not going to react. Then you had the younger people, like young people today probably, like we all were when we were younger. We wanted things to move faster. We wanted things to happen far more quickly. We weren't even exactly sold on nonviolence. It was very difficult to be sold on that. So we wanted to move in another direction. The Freedom Riders and the Freedom Summer movement was outside the norm of the older established people because their thing was marching and protesting, which was very effective. But just like everything else in the world, there's no such thing as one size fits all. There were those of us who got things done one way, then there were other people who got things done in another way. But the one difference that I see in that now than what I see on TV and in the news today is no matter which group we're talking about, you know, we had very strict instructions. We were told what we could do and what we could not do. And if you broke the rules, you were just out. You know, when we were given plans about demonstrating and marching, we were told, we're going to start here at point A, and more often than not, that was at a church. And we're going to march to point B. Nobody's going to get out of the lines. Nobody's going to go off on a tangent over here by yourself. We're not going to confront people even verbally. You know, again, when I watch, you know, people doing protests today, it seems like they're all over the place. You know, like there's really no direction. But again, people do what works for them. Another kind of tie to other than Kent State and Miami, another tie to the Cincinnati area. Probably one of the men that was closest, one of the closest advisors to Martin Luther King was a man called Fred Shuttlesworth. Now, again, I don't know that, you may not know the name from just the name of Fred. You might know the name of the street. There is a street it's right off Reading Road, I believe, that's named for him. He was one of the major civil rights leaders of that era. He lived in Alabama, but he took over as pastor of a church down there on that street. So he would go back and forth from Alabama to Cincinnati, working. But while he was in Cincinnati, he was organizing people in the Cincinnati area as well. And ultimately, he had a street named for him. Now, he and Martin Luther King, again, did not always agree on how things should be done or what should be done, but everybody respected everybody else's opinions. And people learned to talk things through. Fred Shuttlesworth, when he was living in Alabama, there were at least 3 attempts made on his life, outright attempts. His family home was bombed some 3 or 4 times. He was jailed any number of times, but none of that stopped him. You know, he was very dedicated to that. He, I don't know if any of you've ever been down the church. I haven't been in years, but there used to be a museum attached to that church. It would have memorabilia from him that he had donated from the Civil Rights Movement. Very, very interesting man. And in doing, in researching and looking up things, I'm thinking, probably, aside from the street, there's not a lot of people, even in Cincinnati, who knows who Fred Shuttlesworth was. But you should, because he made a lot of great contributions to that whole movement. And Martin Luther King said of him that he was probably the most courageous fighter for civil rights that the South had ever seen. But again, and again, these are people that we didn't get taught about at school, and we should have. And we went to back talking about the Freedom Summer movement. I think one of the things that's always struck me is, just as there was a number of different civil rights movements going on at the same time, one of the things that we all should never forget, there were a lot of people who contributed to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement and the protests and the demonstrations and all of those things were not done just by black people. As a matter of fact, if you go back and look at old pictures or tapes from the movies, one of the things from that movement, one of the things that's going to jump out at you right away, especially almost always in the front line of any demonstration, was the clergy. There were Catholic priests, there were rabbis, there were ministers, almost always. And there were people from the South where all of this stuff was taking place who were great allies of the civil rights movement, not just in voicing, but in providing resources. So we need to always think of that old thing, it takes a village. And the village that it took was all people who thought that everybody had a right to be treated as human beings. Not everybody thought that, but not everybody was against us either. And not all of the black ministers in the South were on board with the civil rights movement. I didn't understand it then, but as I've gotten older, and now I'm really old, but as I've gotten older, I've come to understand it. You had a number of people, and this is before there were black women ministers. So most of these people were men. These were men who in their communities had always been the leaders in their community, the people who other people in their communities turned to. And what they saw was churches being burned, homes being burned, people being put out. And in their way of thinking, yeah, things are bad right now. Things are very, very bad. But are they going to be worse if we lose our churches, if we don't have anywhere to go? They cautioned, they always cautioned, they were very cautious in what they did. Now, there was another segment of those same people who took the same tack that Bayard Rustin did. They would do things behind the scenes, but they never, ever wanted their names to be out front. Give you a perfect example. During the bus boycotts in Montgomery, a number of these ministers who were not out front arranged transportation through other people in other people's cars so that these people could be transferred. and I know I'm saying a lot about women, but that's just a fact. Women played a major, major, major role in the civil rights movement. They did things that I don't expect people today would be able to do. You know, they were for the bus boycotts, the majority of the people who were boycotting were women. And if you think about it, because they were the one that rode the buses. Most of them were domestics. So they took the buses from their neighborhoods into the places where they worked. Now, I tell you, one thing about me that I can tell you, and it's been that way with me all my life, I am not a walker. I do not like walking. I don't do it unless I absolutely have to. I would have been one of those people that would have had to hold my nose and cover my eyes not to get on that bus and to walk instead. Because walking just ain't my thing, and never would have been. And I applaud them for having the tenacity to say, hey, I believe in what I'm doing, and if that means that I have to walk 10 blocks one way in the morning and 10 blocks another way in the afternoon, in all kinds of weather, I'm willing to do that. And guys, I don't know that we men would have been that, I mean, that's just, you know, but that's just the way things work. Now, in Cincinnati, for an example, the first black person, first black mayor in Cincinnati was Ted Berry. Great man, great civil rights leader. Mr. Berry ended up getting an appointment by President Roosevelt during the war years to assist in not just recruiting blacks, but helping to assist people as they came back. The first black woman on the Cincinnati City Council was Marion Spencer. And I'm sure that some of you may have heard of her along the way. Now, if we move even further to the county, right now there are three people, county commissioners, and they're all women. Driehaus is the most senior one, but Stephanie Dumas, who was a mayor in Forest Park, was the first black person elected to the county commissioners in Hamilton County. And then there's Alicia Reese, who is the third one. So, you know, this civil rights movement have touched Cincinnati in some way. We've been there. And there were a lot of women like that from the beginning. There was a woman called Ella Baker. She was one of the people who helped found the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission. But one of the most famous ones was Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer was a Mississippian. She organized the Freedom Democratic Party. Back during the election in the 1960s, 1964, even though black delegates were elected to the conventions, they were not allowed to be seated or to be counted when they were deciding who the nominees were going to be. So she broke away from, she absenced herself from the men and said, this is too important to overlook, because the politicians were trying to make deals with the black people to say, we'll give you this, but if you don't come to the convention and create a habit. But she refused. And they did end up allowing 2 people to be seated, but they still would not allow them to vote with the rest of the group. Then, of course, most of us are old enough to know that the name Shirley Chisholm. She was the first black woman to be elected to the United States Congress. There were a lot of inventions that about blacks that went unnoticed at the time, because there was a time when black people were not allowed to hold patents. One of these men was Alexander Miles. He invented the automatic elevator doors. For those, again, God, I'm telling my age, for those of you who are younger than me, you may not remember, but back in the day, there had to be an operator on the elevator, where you just couldn't get in and push the buttons. There was somebody there to do it for you. And they were the kinds of doors that there was the regular doors, and there was like a chain door. You had to close them both and make sure they were all closed. And he was the man who did that. Then there was Mr. Morris, Garrett Morris. We run into him every day. Some of us don't pay as much attention to him as we probably should. But he invented the 3-position traffic lights. Unfortunately, I think they need to be bigger, and we need to have people who really understand what they mean. Now, here again, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but unfortunately, as we go through life and through time and history, things change. One of the things that have changed in our society is driving. You know, back when I was learning how to drive or trying to get my driver's license, you had to know what the yellow light was for. It was not just a yellow light. There was a reason that it was there. And more importantly than that, there is a word that I think they have completely taken out of the English language, and that word is yield. You know, you're supposed to, when you come to a certain position, you're supposed to yield. Well, since we don't know what that word means, we don't yield. I had a discussion some months back with some people from the highway department, and they were asking for suggestions, and one of my suggestions, and it has been for a long time, nobody should ever be allowed to turn right on red. And the reason we shouldn't be allowed to do it is because we have no idea when you're supposed to do it. It does not mean you can turn right on red. It means you can turn right on red after you have stopped and made sure that nothing was coming from the other way. Now, here in Forest Park, Madam Mayor, and it's probably still the same, there are 2 intersections here in Forest Park that's on the top 10 list for accidents. And almost always it's because people trying to beat the yellow light, or people not knowing that they're supposed to stop before they turn right on red. And both those intersections have stoplights. The one right up here at say Kemper and Winton, and the other one street down from Kemper Meadow in Winton. We have more accidents in those than we do in all the rest of them in Forest Park. And it's simply because we don't do what we're supposed to do when we're supposed to do it. Then, now, a few years ago, we had the pandemic. And as a result, we were supposed to stay at home whenever we, wear masks. But one of the other things that came from that pandemic that was a good thing, was Zoom. We couldn't all go out to meetings, so we started doing Zoom meetings so we could meet, we could have meetings. The person who developed that Zoom was a lady by the name of Marion Crowe, a black lady. She developed Zoom. And along with Zoom, another scientist lady, Marie Brown, patented closed-circuit TVs, so that those are the kind of, like the doorbell camera and all of those kind of things, you can take use of that. Another one of the ones that is extremely important, and you probably was taught a little bit about him in school, there was a doctor by the name of Charles Drew. Now, Charles Drew did a lot of research on blood plasma, which led to blood banks. Millions and millions of people's lives have been saved and prolonged because of blood transfusions from this idea of blood banks. The irony of it is, he was in a car accident, and he died because they would not admit him to the closest hospital, which was all white, so that he could get a blood transfusion. Then, of course, there are a number of politicians out there. There are now 2 black United States senators, one of whom is Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, and the other one, actually there are 3, Warnock, who's a senator from Georgia, and Tim Scott, who's also a senator. There are 2 now lady senators, black senators. Lisa Rochester from Delaware is one, and another is Angela Alsobrooks from Maryland. Now, before them, there was a gentleman by the name of Ed Brooks. He was the first black person elected to the Senate since post-Civil War days. Ed Brooks was he was a Republican senator from Massachusetts. He was a member of the Kennedy Family Circle advisors. A very, very intelligent man. And there was Dr. Bunch, of course, who was the first black person to win the Nobel Prize for Peace, because he mediated a settlement agreement between the Arabs and the Israelis in the Middle East. Now, in Forest Park, I don't know how many of you live here in this great city of ours. The first mayor of Forest Park was, this was 1961, was a guy by the name of Don Gerhardt. The first lady member of the Forest Park City Council was Lorraine Blackwell. She was the clerk of court for a number of years before she was elected to the city council. The first black person on the city council was a gentleman by the name of Edward Rager. And the first black woman was Kathleen Barrett, and she was also the first black mayor in Forest Park back in 1993. There's just so much stuff out there about history that got left out. And it's a shame that it got left out. Now, what I'm about to say, I want you to listen very carefully to me when I'm saying it, because if you repeat it to somebody, I want to make sure you repeat it accurately, because I have been accused of being anti-this or anti-that. One of my greatest wishes, and unfortunately, I don't know that I'll live long enough to ever see it happen. I wish we would have long ago reached this point, but since we haven't, I hope somewhere close down the road we will. I would like to see our world reach a point where we don't have to have a Women's Rights Month or Women's History Month, or we don't have to have a Black History Month, or we don't have to have a Hispanic History Month. I wish we could reach that place where we had a celebration of all American citizens and their contributions to this country. Now, there have been people who say, well, why would you ever say a thing like that? Because that's what I feel. You know, I feel like we can do far, far more together than we can do apart. Now, the reason I said don't misquote me and don't misunderstand me, I am not saying, and never would say, that we should not honor those people who are Italians or Irish or women or blacks or Hispanics. We should, but it ought to be an automatic because it should already be a part of the history books. But unfortunately, we haven't become that civilized yet. And until we do, we have to keep doing it this way, separating out differences. But wouldn't it be nice if that didn't exist? Do you know that there is, have you ever gone to or been to a daycare center, especially in where the very young kids are in the daycare center? If you have, and I'm talking about the kids who are just barely learning how to walk and talk and whatever, there is no such thing as sexism and racism among those kids. See, those isms comes from being passed along by us to a younger generation of people who could care less. If you go to that daycare center and see those little people, they're all over each other, they're hugging each other, they're laughing together, they're playing together, they're kissing on each other. Now, I'm telling you something that from experience that I know about, because see, as you mentioned, when I first started working, I took a job as a teacher in suburban St. Louis. Well, I was replacing a gentleman who was retiring, but he needed 5 more days on the job before he could retire. So I was given, they had hired me, so they had to find something for me to do for 5 days. Unfortunately, one of the teachers at one of the elementary schools was ill. So I was sent in to replace her for those 5 days. Now, again, ladies, I don't know how you do it, but you manage. I was given a kindergarten class. Now, this is in St. Louis in January. Now, the kids are coming in. They don't wear gloves. What do you call them? Mittens? That their mamas pinned to their sleeves so they wouldn't lose them, I guess. And they had on these like Michelin guys, coats, shoes, and they all zipped up all the way to here. And hey, I'm telling you, where's your seat? You said, they're all sitting there and all that stuff. The lady from across the hall came and said, well, they shouldn't be sitting here in their car. They should be. And I thought she meant that I should be giving them an activity or something to do. So I said, okay, no problem, I can do that. So I never ask kids if you don't want an answer. What would you like to do? They all wanted to paint, the water paint. Well, I didn't think about taking the mittens and the coats off. I just went around to the table and put out the paint. And they started painting, and they were painting everything, each other and everything. Somebody came over and said, you have to help them to take I can barely zip up my own coat. How am I supposed to help these people get out of this stuff? But, again, once you have interacted with those kids, it becomes very clear to you earlier, very clear to you right away. These kids love each other. And they don't love each other because Jenny lives next door to me or Jenny looks like me. They love each other because they are kids and they have not yet been taught how to hate. Do you think we'll ever get to that? Do you think we'll ever get there? I hope we will. I would love nothing better than for us to get there. But like I said, I'm sure at my age now, I'm not going to be around to see it. And that's one of my regrets, that I will not be around to see this country and this world come to what I know it can be if we all just give it a little bit of a chance. Now, I know that's a little bit off the subject of quote Black history, but to me, you see, you can't move forward in the world if you don't know what happened back there. And the more we know about each other and what happened back there, the more we're going to be able to help each other to get to where we need to get. And that's not just based on race. That's based on, that's based on gender. I get so tired sometimes when I hear, will we ever have a black woman president? Or will we ever have a woman president? Why are we even asking questions like that? If they're qualified to do the job, why not? I mean, the world was not made for one race of people or one gender of people. It was made for all of us. And all of us ought to be out there trying to make sure that, I see the little baby back there, and I guarantee you that kid does not have a clue about colors. That kid does not have a clue about sexism and all those other isms. And I hope to God that that child never will. Now, I think I probably ran over my time, but if you got any questions at all about anything, hey, any questions at all about anything? See, I'm just on my job when I was working, negotiating contracts for teachers, primarily teachers and school employees. There were two guys that I worked with from the other side, two lawyers who represented the school districts, Bill Anderson, George Roberts. And George used to say to me, Chuck, don't come in here giving me that I'm just a little old country boy attitude, because I know better than that. But that's all I'm just a little old country boy. Thank you all very much.
I want to tell you a little story that highlights something that he talked about, children not knowing until we teach them differences. I know Chuck and I go back 40 plus years. He has been to my family's homes, and when my nieces were little babies. And he had been at the family, and he had one of my nieces on his lap. And she'd been around him many a time, and all of a sudden she goes, Chuck, you're black. This had never occurred to her until that time. She probably learned that somewhere at school, that there are differences in colors. Never occurred to her until he's sitting on him and looking at him and saying, Chuck, you're black. Kids are taught. Kids are taught. And we need to retain that childlike understanding that people are people. So thank you for pointing that out.
Thank you.